The Reformation of the Soviet Red Army. The Soviet Red Army was the main fighting force of the USSR. It contained all the tanks, infantry, and aircraft that the nation possessed. It was first formed during the Russian Revolution, also known as the October Revolution, by the Communists. It was later disbanded to be replaced by the Russian military after the fall of the Soviet Union. The Russian Red Army was very poorly trained and poorly equipped. This is mostly due to the fact that they had many conscripts in their army. A conscript is someone forcibly pressed into military service, usually during times of conflict, although in this case, many were pressed into service during times of peace. They were usually farmers or laborers and had no combat experience, many not even have held a gun before. Comrade commissars, or Russian political officers, were Communist Party members given command of men. They were not actually officers, but their own branch of the military. They would advise officers on their actions. Although technically being called advising is much more like commanding, as you did not want to cross the Communist Party of Russia. Stalin was a ruthless man. He instigated many reigns of terror, as they were called, and killed many citizens of the Soviet Union. This was mostly due to paranoia. In both the citizenry and the military, there is a certain aspect of the fear of the government that kept everyone in line. After all, you didn't want to have a knock on your door in the night, even if you were serving the Soviet Union as a soldier. The Red Army's track record was by no means spotless. The only real victory they had won in conflict had been the Russian Civil War. They lost a war to the Polish, and they lost a war to the Finnish, both nations becoming independent entities, separate of the new USSR. The Red Army was not picky with who it recruited. It would recruit people from anywhere in the nation. And since it was a very big nation, this meant that Mongolians, Russians, and Siberians would all fight alongside each other in the name of one single entity. Comrade Stalin, or the Man of Steel, was one of the main factors in the inadequacy of the Soviet military. Many promising commanders were shot during his reign of terror, and he constantly interfered in military matters that he had very little understanding of. Soviet tanks rarely cooperated with their infantry counterparts. They would often either go too far ahead of the column and be destroyed after being singled out, or they would stay too far behind the column and be destroyed by infantry that had anti-tank weaponry. They also didn't have radios and had trouble communicating with each other, sometimes even firing on each other. Soviet planes had many of the same issues that Soviet tanks had. They didn't have radios and had trouble communicating with each other. They also sometimes bombed their own men by accident and couldn't communicate with ground forces to know what their new objectives should be. These issues would soon come to a head during the Soviet-Finnish War. The Soviet Union asked for lands from Finland for what they said were national defense purposes. Finland refused and war was declared. The Soviets tried to imitate the Germans and do a blitzkrieg, or a lightning strike, against the Finnish heartland. The snows were too deep and they didn't have enough tanks though, so many infantry squadrons were surrounded and destroyed, causing incredible casualties for the Russian people. Although in the end the Soviet Union did get the land they asked for, they also lost 300,000 soldiers versus the Finnish 70,000, so it wasn't really worth it. It was clear that drastic changes needed to be made to Soviet high command and Soviet infantry at the very lowest levels if it was to compete with the rest of the world in modern war. Sadly, for the Soviet Union that is, these actions were not taken immediately, instead being brushed off. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was a pact between Soviet Russia and the German Reich that said that there is a mutual pact of non-aggression, aka they wouldn't go to war with each other and wouldn't help anyone going to war with the other nation. This was broken by the Germans, who did a lightning war, or blitzkrieg, upon the Russians, taking many industrial areas. The Russians were completely unprepared for this, and their incompetent military was almost entirely beaten on every front by the Germans. By now, the Soviet Union completely understood that it should have fixed its military while it still had the chance. Sadly, that chance was gone, and as such, they had to completely reorganize their main fighting force in an incredibly short amount of time, not to mention rebuild their infrastructure that was lost to the Germans. This was going to be an incredibly hard feat. The early German victories had an incredible social impact on the Russian populace. There was now an aura of defeatism, thinking that the Germans were just going to crush them. After all, their military was incompetent, and Stalin wasn't prepared for this at all. It also characterized the economy of the nation, with much of its industrial heartland being taken over by the German Reich. There was very little to produce consumer goods or military matters, and politically speaking, it was a hell of a mess. At this point, the situation seemed almost impossible to win for the Soviets. It was going to fall, just another domino in the German Reich's conquest of Europe. The economy of the Union was in shambles, the people were scared, and the politics were strained, to say the least. It would have been a miracle if they were even to hold out for another year. But they did better. They pushed back. The Soviets knew that the entire fate of the nation rested on the reformation of the Soviet Army, the Red Army. As it currently was, it was too incompetent, too bloated, and too ineffective to successfully fight off the Germans. As such, drastic changes were needed. Stalin, during the early parts of the conflict, took direct control of the military. He forbid retreat and told his men to die before giving up an inch of land. Most importantly, the Soviet government had to deal with the most pressing issue: the support of the people. They had to turn the public opinion away from defeatism, and they had to twist the depressive aura that followed the nation into a white-hot rage. If they had the population on their side, the rest would follow. And they did. It became the Great Patriotic War. You couldn't go a block without seeing propaganda posters just decrying the German Reich as the fascist oppressors that would be destroyed. Surprisingly, this worked. The people no longer feared defeat as much as they hated the German invaders and wanted to rid them from Russian lands. With the people on their side, the Great Patriotic War could truly begin in earnest. Now that they had a supporting population to fight, they needed things to arm them with. They needed factories to produce goods. They needed food. That is where the economy comes in. Due to Stalin's varied 5-year plans, or plans of rapid industrialization over the course of 5 years, the Soviet Union did have marginally good industrial output, although not nearly to the scale of the Germans. Most of this industrial land was in the much warmer heartland of Russia, which was seized during the beginning of the German invasion, causing them to have to relocate. After many major industrial sectors were seized, the Soviets felt the lack of supplies and production heavily. They could not equip their army as much as they'd like. As such, there was a need for rapid industrialization. They chose the Ural Mountains due to their defensibility and distance from the front line. How fast it was industrialized was truly amazing, and I highly doubt any other country could have done this feat. This newly ramped up production allowed the Soviets to stabilize the front with the German Reich. It allowed them to supply their divisions better and to start making tanks to try and counter German armor that was pushing so hard against them. The Soviets had the support of the people, and they had the means to arm said people. Only one thing remained: the politics and the bureaucracy of the state. If they were to achieve a streamlined and adaptable military, then they would have to cut off the bloated bureaucracy of the military-industrial complex. Politically, it was a good choice to have commissars within the Red Army's ranks. They ensured that orders were followed and that all men showed loyalty to the Communist Party. Militarily, it was a dreadful situation. Commissars inspired loyalty through fear. This fear often made actual officers who knew what they were doing too scared to retreat or use complex maneuvers in case the commissar accused them of cowardice and executed them. It was even worse for the common men. They often got told to charge or be executed. Low morale and high casualties were the only things this achieved. When the Red Army entered Berlin, some of the fiercest fighting in the entire war took place. The Nazis conscripted any civilians they could get their hands on to defend the city. Children, women, and old men were given rifles and suicide vests and told to kill the communist invaders. The Soviets had to clear the city out building by building in close-quarters combat, slowly making their way to the Reichstag. By the time the Red Army had fought its way to the Reichstag and defeated its defenders, the war was already lost for the Germans. If the Soviet Union was not so efficient with its reformation, then we might be living in a Nazi world. The Red Army was the most important factor in the defeat of Nazi Germany. This being made clear as Yevgeny Kaldey raised the Soviet flag above the Reichstag, the seat of Nazi authority.